Madam President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I'm honored to present an update on the progress made by the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission for the Sudan, which I refer to as FFM Sudan, in accordance with the Human Rights Council's Resolution 54/2. I present this briefing as the chairperson of the mission, and I'm joined by my two other colleagues, Mona Rishwami and Joy Ngozi Ezielo. Sudan has been engulfed in a devastating conflict for over a year now, characterized largely by its urban, widespread nature and its civilian population placed at the center of extreme violence. Blatant disregard for fundamental human rights and international humanitarian law has led to killings, looting, mass displacement, rape and other forms of sexual violence, and resulted in a grave humanitarian crisis with around 18 million people acutely food insecure and 5 million facing starvation, according to the World Food Programme. My colleagues and I are deeply aware of the urgency of the situation. Since our appointment in December 2023, we have been doing our utmost to fulfill the mandate of this Council has bestowed upon us. The liquidity crisis faced by the United Nations Secretariat and the hiring freeze, unfortunately, led to several months of delay in establishing an effective Secretariat. We are pleased that thanks to the special efforts of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Deputy High Commissioner last month, the Secretariat has finally begun its work in Nairobi, Kenya. We thank the Government of Kenya for hosting this mandate. At this point, on board are about 2/3 of the staff contingent that were considered necessary by the General Assembly to fulfill and to fully implement the mandate. It is imperative for us to have adequate resources in order to effectively deliver. This does not mean that we are starting the work only now. First, with thanks to the flexibility and commitment of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, a small number of experienced staff in Geneva was allocated to us from the beginning, which enabled us to start operations. Therefore, from the outset of the mandate, we published a call inviting individuals, groups, and organizations to submit information and documentation relevant to the mandate. Second, we have initiated contacts with the government of Sudan and with governments of neighboring states, Chad, Egypt, Eritrea, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Central African Republic, as well as Kenya and Uganda, requesting their cooperation and access to their territories in order to gather first-hand information from victims of the conflict, including those who have fled Sudan since the outbreak of the violence. Kenya has responded positively, and we've been able to carry out visits to Nairobi, where we met with a number of victims, witnesses, and experts. We are pleased to have received confirmation from the government of Chad that they are also willing to receive us soon for a visit. As this Council's mechanism, we are particularly keen to visit Sudan and interact with the government to hear also their perspectives. We also note that the Rapid Support Forces has expressed through the President of the Council their willingness to cooperate with this mandate. Thirdly, we have engaged with organizations and entities involved in the situation in Sudan, including the High Commissioner, his office, his designated expert on the situation of human rights in Sudan, the personal envoy of the UN Secretary General in Sudan, and other UN senior officials. We also have had a constructive dialogue with the Sudan country rapporteur of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and have reached out to the African Union, the League of Arab States, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, with a request for dialogue and cooperation. The main purpose being to coordinate our efforts and to assure complementarity. Fourthly, even without physical access to Sudan, the fact-finding mission has been able to conduct about 80 direct interviews so far, including with victims and eyewitnesses. We also held meetings and consultations with a considerable number of stakeholders, including civil society representatives, human rights defenders, journalists, academics, and specialized experts on child rights and sexual and gender-based violence. We thank all these individuals and organizations for their constructive cooperation and submission of relevant information. We are particularly grateful to the many Sudanese victims, witnesses, and human rights defenders who have courageously shared their experiences and insight, sometimes at great significant risk for their safety and security. We would like to remind the warring parties that any act of intimidation or reprisal for cooperation with the United Nations is prohibited and will be duly recorded in accordance with our mandate. Excellencies, the information that we have gathered so far indicates that the deadly conflict that began in Sudan on 5th of April 2023, mainly between the Sudan Armed Forces and RSF, is continuing unabated on a massive scale. It now involves multiple actors within and outside Sudan and has spread from Khartoum and Darfur to most of the countries. We are deeply concerned that the fighting persists with tragic consequences and enormous suffering of the civilian population. We have received credible accounts of indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian objects, including through airstrikes and shelling in heavily populated residential areas, as well as ground attacks against civilians in their homes and villages. In the capital Khartoum and its close vicinity, Omdurman and Bahari, at the outbreak of the conflict, the intense clashes, airstrikes, and heavy artillery shelling, including residential areas and attacks on schools, hospitals, and medical facilities, resulted in killings and injuries of civilians, including women and children, and forced many to leave their homes and property to seek refuge in other locations. Reports of looting and sexual violence have added to this exodus. We are particularly concerned about the situation in Darfur, especially the siege of Al-Fasher, North Darfur by RSF. Al-Fasher, as you know, is the capital of Darfur with about 1.5 million inhabitants. It hosts approximately 800,000 internally displaced persons. Already heavy fighting between the warring factions in different parts of the city has led to significant civilian casualties, damaged homes, and caused mass displacement. The attack on one of the main and last functioning hospitals in the city on the 8th of June led to its closure, leaving the civilian population without access to life-saving medical care. We call on all parties to abide by Security Resolution 2736 of 2024, which demands that the RSF halt the siege of El-Fasher and calls for an immediate halting to the fighting. The Security Council resolution also calls for the protection of all civilians and for warring parties to allow and facilitate rapid, safe, unhindered, and sustained passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need, including by removing bureaucratic and other impediments. We call on all parties to heed the Security Council's call on the parties to reopen the Adre border crossing for the delivery of humanitarian assistance. We further call upon all states to abide by the Security Council arms embargo imposed on Darfur pursuant to Resolution 1556 of 2004. We also note the call of the prosecutor of the ICC for information regarding this unfolding situation and urge all parties to fully cooperate with his office. Previous attacks on other areas compound our concern. We are currently investigating earlier large-scale attacks against civilians based on their ethnicity in other areas of Darfur, and that have included killings, rape and other forms of sexual violence, torture, forced displacement, and looting, including in Genena and later in Ardamata between April and November last year. Ethnic-based attacks are also under investigation, including in Zalinje, Nyala, and other areas of Darfur, as well as in Kordofan, Al Jazeera, and parts of Greater Khartoum. With regard to the situation in Al Jazeera, we are investigating attacks, including on its capital, Wad Madani, in December 2023, and related killings, injury, arbitrary arrests, and torture of civilians and mass displacement. Recently, on 5th of June, Wad Noura village in Al Jazeera was reported to have been attacked with large and heavy artillery, leading to hundreds of civilian deaths, including numerous children. In all these areas, massive looting and extensive destruction of civilian homes and property continue. Additionally, health facilities have been attacked, pillaged, and destroyed, making it impossible for many injured civilians to get any medical attention. Medical supplies have also been blocked from reaching critical areas. There are reports that many civilians have died from injuries sustained in the conflict due to the unavailability or inaccessibility of medical supplies. The conflict has also led to significant damage of essential infrastructure, including electricity and water supply lines, as well as communication networks. Attacks on medical personnel, including those providing support to victims of sexual violence, are highly disturbing. The conflict continues to cause mass displacement of the civilian population at unprecedented levels. Since the breaking of the conflict, almost 9 million individuals have been forcibly displaced from their homes, with more than 1.8 million fleeing to neighboring countries. We heard from victims how they had to take a long and perilous journey from Khartoum all the way to Egypt, Kenya, or Uganda, sometimes crossing multiple countries in an attempt to escape the brutal conflict. Others were forcibly evicted from their homes by warring parties. Most left nothing and traveled for several weeks to seek safety. We appreciate the efforts of the countries who, despite their limited resources, continue to support the refugees who have fled the conflict in Sudan. Nearly 18 million individuals are facing acute hunger amidst looming famine. At least 5 million civilians, including children and pregnant women, are at risk of starvation, with a minimum response as warring factions continue to obstruct humanitarian access, attack humanitarian workers, and loot humanitarian supplies, thereby curtailing delivery of life-saving support to vulnerable population. In face of this immense suffering, the humanitarian response, which remains largely underfunded with only 16% of the required funds having been received, required urgent international attention. We have also received credible reports of many cases of sexual violence being committed by warring factions, parties across various parts of the country since the start of the conflict. Women and girls have been and continue to be subjected to rape and gang rape, abduction, and forced marriage. Victims and first-line responders told us of how women and girls not only endured violent rape, including gang rape and denial of medical support, but also how they were stigmatized and subsequently abandoned by their families. There are reports of sexual slavery and sexualized torture in detention facilities, including against men and boys, which we are investigating. The majority of survivors have not had access to adequate support due to lack of access to or unavailability of health facilities and the destruction of the health infrastructure. Medical personnel and members of civil society are prevented from or targeted for providing support to victims of social violence. Widespread recruitment and use of children at checkpoints to gather intelligence, as well as to perpetrate indirect combat and commit violent crimes, are also frequently reported, placing the lives and future of many children at risk. In his report of 3rd of June 2024 on children and armed conflict, the UN Secretary General ranks Sudan among the countries with the highest number of grave violations against children being reported, committed by several warring factions, including the Sudan Armed Forces and RSF. There are also credible reports of mass arbitrary arrests of civilians based on suspicion of supporting the other party to the conflict, expressing dissent, or supporting human rights and a return to democratic transition. From the outset of the conflict, the warring parties appear to have been targeting resistance committee members, medical emergency room volunteers, lawyers, journalists, civil society actors, and human rights activists, and subjecting them to threats, attacks, arbitrary arrests, torture, detention, and forced disappearance and killings. Excellencies, our mandate also requires us to examine, and this is unique, the root causes of all alleged violations and abuses of human rights in international humanitarian law and related crimes. We have so far identified a number of structural and systematic issues, as well as those related to policies and conduct. These include continued arming of civilians without meaningful control, the mobilization of militias and armed groups on an ethnic basis, and the shielding from accountability those persons and entities responsible for atrocious crimes. Some of these practices are being revived by the warring parties from past conflicts and are laying the ground for current and future cycles of serious violation. The national legal system appears unable to conduct prompt, independent, and credible investigation or to prosecute persons in a manner consistent with international human rights norms and standards. It is therefore crucial to combat impunity. Your Excellencies, it is hard to see human rights and the humanitarian situation in Sudan improve without an immediate ceasefire. We note the Security Council's call on 8th of May by Resolution 2724 for the immediate cessation of hostilities in Sudan during the month of Ramadan without avail. Regrettably, the fighting never stopped and continues with full intensity until now, 3 months later. While appealing for the fighting to stop immediately, we need the commanders of warring parties to issue instruction to the forces of militia under their control to strictly abide by the international humanitarian law, by their international obligation, and also as iterated in the Jeddah Declaration. Civilians must be protected, and against exam, including killings, looting, sexual violations, and forced displacement, must be punished in conformity with international humanitarian and human rights law. We further call upon warring parties to refrain from attacking humanitarian workers, stop obstructing the delivery of aid, and allow unfettered humanitarian access to the millions of civilians in need in every part of Sudan. We also appeal to states with influence over any of the warring parties to urgently step up efforts to hold the fighting and bring the parties back to the negotiating table in order to prevent further violations and abuses. As this update demonstrates, the people of the Sudan are crying for help to restore their dignity and rights. They need the support and the attention of this Council. Thank you very much.